Good afternoon. My name is Deborah Gonzalez, and I'm the Government Affairs Director here at Public Policy Institute of California, or PPIC. Thank you for joining us today. And for those of you who have been locked in that building doing negotiations on cap and trade, welcome. We're glad to have you. For those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank with offices in both Sacramento and San Francisco. I put Sacramento first, but some people do it the other way. For today's program, we're going to hear from PPIC researcher David Kordus, who will present the finding of our latest survey on Californians and the environment. We'd like to thank the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, the Dirk and Charlene Capsonell Foundation, the Flora Family Foundation, and the Heisig Simons Foundation for their support of this important survey. You should have received a copy of a couple items on your chair, a document highlighting the survey, as well as just the fact sheets on Californians and the coast. For the full survey report and the slides from today's presentation, you can go to ppic.org. After David's presentation, we'll have plenty of time for audience question and answers. A couple more things before we begin. Later today, you'll receive a survey about the survey presentation. So please do the survey. We really appreciate that. And please turn off your phones. Now a little more about the survey. PPIC does about 10 surveys a year, and most of those are general surveys about California and their government. But 3 times a year we do specialty surveys. We do a K through 12 survey in April, and in the winter we do a higher ed survey. And every July we do an environmental survey, at least in the last decade or so. And that's important because recently in July and in the summer, there's been a lot of debates around environmental issues. And in this case, this year, the survey was actually conducted while the legislature was debating the cap and trade bill. I'm a former legislative staffer. For me, I would have loved to have the survey before I asked my member to vote or oppose the cap and trade bill. So we're a little sorry about that. But I just want you to know there's a couple of things that we learned from the survey in cap and trade. In fact, we asked a lot of questions. There's a lot of really other important things on the environment, but just because I know a lot of you are former staffers or current staffers, and this is an issue still burning in the press and certainly on Twitter, there are a couple things we learned from the survey. One, 50% or more people don't even know what cap and trade is, even while you were debating it hotly on the floor of the legislature. And this says something to me is that I'm apparently the only one who's watching Cal Channel 24 hours a day. So just know it. It's unfortunate, but it's not that they don't care. They just don't know where the Cal Channel is on there. There are 300 channel stations, I believe. But beyond that, I just want you to know that there actually are really a lot of nuances and really important things that you debated and your members debated on the floor that are captured in the survey. And for instance, fortunately and unfortunately, the survey, the results will provide you some clear answers to say, yes, this is a good vote for your member, but it may not provide you those answers. So for instance, there is a broad consensus in California that global warming is affecting the state now or will in the future, even among Republicans. That's just generally a consensus. There's a consensus that clean energy is a popular choice, but after that, it gets a little more nuanced. And the willingness to pay for clean energy or fuels under the cap really starts to get really tightened, and the survey tightens up. And particularly in areas where the population has a long commute for work or is suffering some economic hardships. However, this intuitively makes sense to me, right? You're driving a lot, so you're going to be impacted by this. However, you look at what I love to look at, and David knows I love to look at, and what I would encourage you to look at. When you look at our crosstabs, there are really some more detailed nuances. In these regions that are economically depressed, actually some of the lower income people in those communities are more willing to pay. Still not over 50%, but are willing to pay more than other people. So go to those crosstabs. They're online. We're one of the few polling groups that put those online, so I really encourage you to use them. What does this all mean? I don't know. I can't tell you. That's why we have David here today. So with that, I would like to bring David up to present the survey to you.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you all for being here. It's nice to have a full room. Nice to be back again talking about the statewide survey also. So we have plenty of interesting questions. One finding that jumped out to me was that over a third of Californians said that they visit a beach on the coast at least once a month, which has me thinking I'm not visiting beaches enough. Like that there's a party out there I'm missing. But she highlighted a couple trends that you'll see. A couple other things that you'll see as kind of a pattern in what I share with you is that responses among young adults stand out on a few of these issues compared to older Californians. Also, while there are real differences between the parties and how they feel about environmental issues, particularly climate change, there are, as Deborah noted, some places where there's notable support among Republicans for some actions on climate change. Before I go further, let me acknowledge the co-authors on this survey, Mark Baldessari, Dean Bonner, and Luna Lopez, and myself. So first, what we'll do, I'm just going to give you a little background on the survey and our methodology so you know how we got these results. And then there's two broad sections of material that I'll cover. First, just some general public perceptions. That includes approval ratings, perceptions of air pollution, water supply, ocean issues, and climate change. And then we'll get into policy preferences, most of which is focused on climate change policy, including cap and trade. And then we'll have conclusions and time for Q&A. So first, the statewide survey series, we've done over 160 surveys since 1998. We've interviewed over 340,000 Californians since then. So we have this great database of historical questions and answers, and we look at a lot of trends. So part of what we'll do today is kind of compare responses across time based on those other surveys. The mission of the survey is to provide timely, relevant, nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions, to inform and improve state policymaking, raise awareness, and encourage discussion, and to provide a voice for all Californians in these important state policy debates. This survey in particular is part of our Californians and Environment series, which we've been doing since 2000. This is the 17th survey on the environment. And again, we do it pretty much every July. I want to thank the funders again that Deborah mentioned. To get into the details of how we conducted this survey, it was all done over the period of July 9th through 18th. All the interviews are live telephone interviews done in English or Spanish, depending on the respondent's preference. And we do all this to try to get a representative sample of all California adults. We talked to just over 1,700 adults. The margin of error on their responses is 3.4 percentage points. Talked to just under 1,100 likely voters. Margin of error there is 4.3. And I should mention 65% of the interviews are on cell phone, 35% on landline. So let's get into it. With these public perceptions, first we'll start with approval ratings. What we do in the environment survey is ask about approval overall and also approval on how the officials are handling environmental issues. What you can see here is first the kind of similarity, whether we're asking about overall or environmental approval, and how at the state level, those four questions are all kind of the same, and at the federal level, how those are all similar but quite different from what we see at the state level. So just to get into a little bit of detail on the overall approval for state officials, for both the governor and legislature, they're at about half for approval. That's similar to what we saw when we asked in May, also similar to a year ago, so that's pretty stable. Parties there, it's a solid majority of Democrats, about half of independents, and about 20% of Republicans approving of either the governor or the legislature. Looking at the federal side, it's about a quarter across these questions: president, Congress, overall approval, and environmental approval. For the president, what we see here, 25% is similar to what we've seen when we asked earlier this year. During the period we were doing our survey, the Gallup weekly tracking number was 39%. So 39% nationwide, 25% in California. Bit of a gap there, probably not a huge surprise that we would, in California, Californians would see him differently. You can see that the numbers on the president and Congress are pretty similar, but the sources of that support is coming from different places. Here, this is just kind of a breakdown of party support for the president and for Congress. You can see across parties, Congress has relatively low support, but gets a strong majority from Republicans. The president has a strong majority approval from Republicans. Congress, a little bit more likely to be approved of than the president among Democrats, also among those who aren't registered to vote. There's some interesting trends here on that we've seen among Republicans this year so far. Approval of the president was a bit higher when we asked in March. It was at 82% among Republicans then, down to 68% today. Similarly for Congress, they were at 48% among Republicans in March, and that's dropped to 26% today. I just want to say something else about the environmental approval for the president. He's at 22%. Just for a point of comparison, last year when we asked about President Obama, he was at 60% for his handling of environmental issues. And something else I thought was interesting about those numbers is when we look at President Obama's first year in office, when we asked about how he was handling the environment, 17% said that they didn't know or they didn't have an opinion on that. Today, 8% say they don't have an opinion on Trump on handling environmental issues. So he's got people making up their minds more quickly than Obama did. The last thing I'll cover on approval is I just want to show you kind of a trend on the environmental approval numbers in the state. And this is included in your handout, this chart. But this shows, again, today we have about half approving of the governor and of the legislature on how they're handling environmental issues. And those have both increased since Governor Brown took office in 2011. The governor's number is up by 16 points, the legislature up by 20. And again, those kind of don't know, don't have enough information, not sure. The governor had more of those back in 2011 and fewer today and higher approval. For the legislature, there were some more don't knows back in 2011, but also some more disapproves back in 2011 than what they have today. And of course, over this period, we've had the record drought and some big actions on climate change, among other things. So the first issue that we'll get into is perceptions on air pollution. We ask if you think that air pollution is a big problem, somewhat of a problem, or not a problem in your part of California. And what we find across the state is about a quarter of adults say that it is a big problem for them, and over 6 in 10 say that it's at least somewhat of a problem. About as many have said that over the past 10 years or so. Prior to that, a little bit more were saying air pollution was a problem. In the chart here, you're looking across regions of the state. Those in Los Angeles are most likely to say that air pollution is a big problem. 4 in 10, another 4 in 10 say it's somewhat of a problem for them. In the Orange County and San Diego region, that's where people are most likely to say air pollution is not a problem. Here you can see the Central Valley kind of fits in the middle, but we took a closer look at the 8 San Joaquin Valley counties within the Central Valley, and there 34% say that air pollution is a big problem. So that's kind of getting closer to that, the higher number in LA, 34% within San Joaquin Valley. One other thing I'll mention on this is we found those with incomes below $40,000 were somewhat more likely than those with higher incomes to say air pollution was a big problem where they live. And as Deborah mentioned, we put up the crosstabs on our website. So what that means is if you're interested in more breakdowns, racial and ethnic groups, or education, or whatever else, that information is kind of all available on our website if you're interested in more detail. So this question, again, this is about for you, is air pollution a problem where you live? We asked this other question kind of looking around you, within your region, do you think that air pollution is a bigger problem in lower income areas? And for this, just over half of adults, just under half of likely voters say yes, it is a bigger problem in lower income areas. But you can see the differences across groups here, where African Americans and Latinos are more likely than others to say yes, it's a bigger problem in low income areas. And again, those with lower incomes are more likely to say that. So remember, they were the ones who said it was a bigger problem for them. They're also more likely than those with higher incomes to kind of say, yes, this is a problem in lower income areas. One other thing that we asked about air pollution, and this relates to something that was passed along with the cap and trade extension, we just asked very generally about if you favor or oppose empowering local air districts to require industries to cut down on the emission of air pollutants. When asked that, about 3 in 4 adults and likely voters were in support of empowering local air districts that way. Similar, about 3 in 4 across age, age, income, and region groups, and majorities across parties in favor of that idea. The next issue we'll look at is water supply. Here on this dramatic chart, you can see what we've been tracking, whether people say that their water supply is a big problem today. And the dark blue line up on top, you can see that kind of peaks over the recent drought years. Last July, the last time we asked this, 62% of adults in California were saying their water supply was a big problem, and that's dropped down to 37% saying so today, similar to where we were back in 2012. But even still, there's another line in here, the light blue, saying somewhat of a problem. If you combine those two today, even though the drought is officially over 6 in 10 are saying that their water supply is at least somewhat of a problem. Looking a bit more closely here, these are the responses in light blue across regions of the state. And you can see that those in the Central Valley and in the Inland Empire are most likely to say their water supply is a big problem today. And again, looking within the Central Valley at the San Joaquin Valley, 51% there say that their water supply is a big problem today. So majority there, more than elsewhere, 30% in the San Francisco Bay Area, for example. The dark gray bars on here, this is a separate question, a new question we asked this time around. which is whether your local government is doing too much, the right amount, or not enough in terms of water conservation. On this, a slight majority across the state say that their local government is doing the right amount. About 4 in 10 say that their local government is not doing enough. Here you can see across regions, responses are pretty similar. It's half or more everywhere except for within the Inland Empire, saying doing the right amount. One other question we asked, and this relates to, we asked several questions on ocean and coastal issues, which is on the Just the Facts sheet that you have. We asked about building desalination plants on the California coast. Just a pretty simple question, do you favor or oppose this? And we found 2 in 3 adults and likely voters saying that they're in favor of building desalination plants. The last time we asked this was back in 2006, at which point 56% said that they were in favor of that. So there's been an increase since then with the drought intervening and with 11 years intervening. It's over 6 in 10 today among Democrats, Republicans, Independents, across regions, across age and income groups. So pretty broad support for that. But again, this is just one question. We don't have information, or we don't know what people know about desalination, or what they know about costs, or think about those. This is just, do you favor the idea or not? And again, 2 in 3 said yes. That leads us into the other questions we asked on ocean and coastal issues. As I mentioned, everybody's going to the beach. It's over 7 in 10 saying that they visit a beach on the coast at least several times a year, including over a third saying they visit at least once a month. We also asked about how important the condition of oceans and beaches is. We asked about that in a couple different ways. First, how important is that to the quality of life and economy in the state? And nearly everyone says it's important, with over 7 in 10 saying it's very important to the state's economy and quality of life. We also asked how important the condition of ocean and beaches is to you personally. Again, nearly everyone says important, with about 7 in 10 saying very important. When asking about how important it is to you personally, those on the coast are a little bit more likely than those in inland counties to say so, but still it's about 2 in 3 in inland counties saying it's personally very important to them. There's also a difference in age groups. The younger adults are more likely than older adults to say it's very important to them personally. On this question about not you personally, but for the state economy and quality of life, there's no meaningful differences between age groups or between regions. It's pretty broad across groups. We also asked about a few issues, asking if people thought that these were a problem today. One of them was ocean and beach pollution along the coast, and then there were a few of them where we asked specifically about the part of the coast closest to you. We asked about contamination of fish and seafood, about declining marine life, and about limited public access to the coast and to beaches. For 3 of those, for the beach pollution, marine life, and fish and seafood, responses were pretty similar, with about 8 in 10 saying that these are a problem today, and between 45 and 46% saying that these are a big problem today. For each of those, it's about half of Democrats, half of Independents, and about a third of Republicans saying that they're a big problem. And then this other question, fewer, it was about a half saying that limited access to the coast and beaches is a problem today. For beach pollution, some of the different breaks there that we can look at, it's a majority of younger adults saying that beach pollution is a big problem that you see on the chart here, and fewer than half of older adults saying that beach pollution is a big problem today. And there are similar responses from inland counties and coastal counties when it comes to beach pollution. One final thing I'll mention on this, we asked just generally about the state's marine protected areas, or MPAs, which are managed by the state and protect fish, wildlife, and their habitats in coastal waters. We just asked how important people think it is that the state operates these, and 3 in 4 said it's very important that the state does. That includes majorities across parties. The last big issue we'll look at before we get into kind of the policy specifics is perceptions of global warming. Here's something we've been tracking, you can see, for several years. The question is just, when will the effects of global warming begin? Are they happening now? Will they happen in the future? Or will they never happen? And today, about 2 in 3 adults and likely voters say that the effects are happening right now. Another 21% say that they'll never happen, and 21% say that they'll happen in the future, and just 8% say that the effects will never happen. This response that we're seeing is similar to what we saw last year, and going back to 2011, at least 6 in 10 have said the effects are happening right now. The light blue trend line here, this is from Gallup surveys. They've been asking the same question over this period. You can see today, Californians' opinions and those of adults nationwide are pretty similar, but there is this kind of gap across time where those in California are a little bit more likely than those in the nation as a whole to say the effects are happening right now. Across parties, it's a strong majority of Democrats and independents, and 40% of Republicans who say that the effects have already begun. The way I think about this is that in order to kind of get to supporting some of the policies that the state has on climate change, there's a few gates you have to get through, and this is one. Are the effects happening now? Will they happen in the future? The next thing is, are these a threat to the state? So we ask, how serious of a threat is global warming to the economy and quality of life in California? On this, majorities of adults and likely voters say that it's a very serious threat to the state. 8 in 10 say it's at least somewhat serious. And at least half have said that it's very serious going back to 2014. Today, across parties, again, it's 2 in 3 Democrats, about half of independents, and about a quarter of Republicans saying it's a very serious threat. Here, looking across racial and ethnic groups, you can see Latinos are most likely to say it's a serious threat, very serious. Whites least likely. I think it's interesting, just by coincidence, the same numbers for those under 35 and those above 55 years of age, 70 to 48, so that same gap. Those under 35, 70% say it's a very serious threat. Those above 55, 48% say it's a very serious threat. One other issue we asked about specifically, the threat of rising sea levels as a consequence of global warming. On this, about a third said that they're very concerned about rising sea levels, but another third said that they're somewhat concerned, and then the final third said they're either not concerned or they have no opinion on that. Those on the coast are somewhat more likely than those in inland regions to say that they're very concerned about rising sea levels. Across parties, it's about half of Democrats, about 3 in 10 independents, and 13% of Republicans saying that they're very concerned about rising sea levels. So now we can get into, again, some of the policy specifics, largely focused on climate change policy. And first, let's take a look at this national issue, which is President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, which is the international agreement trying to address climate change. Low levels of support for the president's decision here in California. 22% of adults support his decision, 71% are opposed to it. We compared that to a similar question asked in an ABC News Washington Post survey. Across the country, 28% were in favor of his decision, compared to 22% here. So a little bit of a difference, and not particularly a lot of support in the country as a whole. Looking in California, here are the numbers by party. You can see an overwhelming majority of Democrats opposed to that decision, along with a majority of independents and about a third of Republicans saying they're opposed to the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. So, as I mentioned, the President and Congress have relatively low ratings on handling environmental issues. About a quarter here approve. There's low approval of this decision. So what do people think about California climate change policy? We've been asking for a while if you favor or oppose the state government making its own policies separate from the federal government to address the issue of global warming. And what we find is today, over 6 in 10 adults and 6 in 10 likely voters favor the state taking its own action on climate change. And majorities of adults have said that going back to 2005. I'll get into a little bit more detail, but let me tell you about another question we asked. We've seen the governor has made an effort to engage with other countries on climate change. He's called for a climate summit next year in San Francisco. So we wanted to ask, how important, if at all, is it that the state acts as a global leader when it comes to fighting climate change? And on this, we found majorities of adults and likely voters say it's very important that the state act this way, and over 8 in 10 say it's at least somewhat important that the state act as a leader around the world on climate change. For both the state taking its own action and for the state acting as a leader, there are similar responses across parties, which you can see here. Majorities of Democrats and independents in favor or saying it's very important. Among Republicans, a third say they're in favor of the state making its own policies. A quarter say it's very important that the state act as a global leader. If you include those who say it's at least somewhat important, it's nearly half of Republicans saying it's important that the state act as a global leader. So getting into some specific policies, first we asked about the emissions reduction goal that was passed as part of SB 32. So this would have the state get to 40% below its 1990 level of emissions by the year 2030. Today, 72% of adults and 2 in 3 likely voters are in favor of that reduction goal. In the past, we had been asking about the AB 32 goal, which set the state on a path to 1990 levels by the year 2020. And each time we asked about that since 2007, we had at least 2 in 3 in favor of it. So really similar numbers in support today for this more ambitious goal of SB 32 compared to what we had been seeing for AB 32. On SB 32, strong majorities in favor among Democrats and independents, and 42% of Republicans in favor of that goal. Here, an age finding that I thought was striking was 80% of those under 35 favor this SB 32 goal. So that's regardless of their party or race or income or whatever, 80% of those under 35 in favor of this greenhouse gas reduction goal. Another goal we looked at is the proposal that the legislature is considering that would have the state reach 100% renewable energy or electricity by the year 2045. And we found 7 in 10 adults and likely voters in favor of this 100% renewable goal. That includes over 6 in 10 across regions and across all the demographic groups we look at, so including income, age, and majorities across parties in favor of that goal. Now, that's kind of just a goal without costs or anything associated with it. So we have this separate question, which is, would you be willing to pay more for electricity from renewable sources as a way to fight global warming? On this, about half tell us that they are willing to pay more among adults and among likely voters. If you compare the bars here, you can see there's less willingness than there is support for the goal across parties, though 6 in 10 Democrats say that they would be willing to pay more for electricity. Looking across income groups, low, medium, and high, it's around 50%, 50 to 53% saying they would be willing to pay more. And looking across the state, there are majorities in the San Francisco Bay Area and in Orange County and San Diego saying they would be willing to pay more, but somewhat fewer in other regions of the state. So that's the first question we asked, kind of about the costs of these state policies. We also asked about potential impact on jobs in the state and on gas prices. So do you think that California doing things to reduce global warming in the future would cause more jobs, fewer jobs, or would have no effect? So looking at jobs first, it's 50% today, and about half of likely voters saying they expect more jobs as a result of the state's global warming policies. Each time we've asked this, going back to 2010, more jobs has been the most common response. This is the first time it's reached 50%, though. This is the highest number we've seen saying they expect more jobs. Another 22% say that 19% say it wouldn't affect the number, and 22% say they would expect fewer jobs as a result of these state policies. Saying they expect more jobs, that's the most common response across regions of the state, across demographic groups, again, including age and income and racial and ethnic groups. Across parties, it's 2 in 3 Democrats saying they would expect more jobs, half of independents, and 21% of Republicans saying they expect more jobs. So, as a whole, relatively optimistic answers about the job outcomes. When we look at gasoline prices, though, a majority say they expect higher gas prices as a result of the state taking action on global warming. So 54% say that among both adults and likely voters. That's similar to what we found last year when we asked this for the first time. And higher gas prices is the most common response across regions of the state, again, across all the demographic groups we look at. And looking across regions, it's about 6 in 10 in the Inland Empire and 6 in 10 in the Central Valley saying they expect higher gas prices, and about half in other regions saying that. So again, this is a few questions we asked about the expected costs. So how does that relate to whether people support policies? Specifically, I can talk about the support for that SB 32 emission reduction goal. Among those supporting it, 60% told us that they expect more jobs. So a majority there in favor of SB 32, expecting more jobs, but again, about 40% supporting SB 32, but not necessarily expecting more jobs as a result. Also, among those supporting it, 47% expect higher gas prices. So those are the people we would say, okay, they sound like they're willing to pay higher costs for this. But then about half supporting SB 32 aren't expecting higher gas prices. Conversely, among those opposed to SB 32, 46% expect fewer jobs, so maybe motivated by that, but again, about half not necessarily expecting fewer jobs, but still opposed to SB 32. And among those opposed, 75% are expecting higher gas prices. So now we can get into cap and trade, which we were fortunate enough to ask a few questions on. Anytime we ask about cap and trade, we first just ask the level of knowledge about it. Have you heard a lot, a little, or nothing at all? And as Deborah mentioned, a majority of adults told us they've heard nothing at all about cap and trade. A small majority of likely voters said they have heard at least a little bit about it. And both of those responses have been steady since we've been asking since 2012. It's kind of the same level of knowledge that we hear. So what we do is provide a short description of the program and then ask if people favor or oppose it. And what we found in this survey is 56% of adults and 49% of likely voters saying that they favor the system. Those are similar to where we found it last July, but again, this is a high point in support, the 56 number among adults and 49 among likely voters, the highest we've measured in our surveys. Here you can see on the chart across parties, majorities of Democrats and independents are in favor, and about a third of Republicans are in favor of the cap and trade system. So we got into a bit more detail, and we had another question where we gave a description of how cap and trade revenues are spent. We also said that one legislative analyst estimate has cap and trade adding 15 cents per gallon by 2021. With this additional information, we found 60% of adults and 51% of likely voters saying that they favor the state reducing greenhouse gas emissions through cap and trade. As with when we ask about cap and trade generally, majorities of Democrats are in favor, about 3 in 10 Republicans are in favor after hearing this additional information. What's interesting, what we're showing on the chart here, is that across income groups, those with the lowest annual household incomes are most likely to say that they favor the system after hearing about where the money is spent and this one estimate of an additional 15 cents by 2021. Another question we asked, kind of getting into the detail on it, we asked about the idea of a ceiling on the price for permits. And the way we posed that was thinking about the permits that allow businesses to put out greenhouse gases. Do you favor or oppose setting a ceiling on the price businesses pay for these permits, even if that makes it less certain that the state will meet its greenhouse gas reduction goals? So the idea there was just trying to assess people's priorities if you were to balance between limiting cost to business versus the state's climate change goals. And what we found was about half of adults and 44% of likely voters said they were in favor of setting a ceiling. And interesting across the parties that both Democrats and Republicans are kind of evenly split between favoring and opposing a ceiling. So kind of my interpretation of what's happening there is if you favor cap and trade, maybe it's a tough call if you're being asked, limiting costs versus meeting the state's goals. And if you're opposed to cap and trade, maybe you want to limit costs, but you also just think cap and trade is bad, so you're saying you oppose the ceiling. One final question we asked on cap and trade, and this is about the idea of spending its revenues on projects to improve environmental conditions in lower income and disadvantaged communities. 54% of adults, so just over half, and just under half of likely voters say it's very important that cap and trade revenues are spent this way. And the responses here are pretty similar to what we found when we asked about their perception of air pollution in lower income areas, where there was just over half of adults, just under half of likely voters, saying they thought air pollution was a bigger problem in lower income areas. So here when we're asking about, is it important that the money is spent in those areas, similar responses, and again, similar among these groups, where Latinos and African Americans are most likely to say that's very important, and again, those with lower incomes are more likely than others to say it's very important to spend revenues this way. Across parties, it's 2 in 3 Democrats, about half of independents, and 22% of Republicans saying that it's very important that cap and trade revenue is spent in these communities. The last thing we'll look at is a couple questions on energy policy. Here is our trend line on asking if you favor or oppose more oil drilling off the coast. And what you can see is we had 25% in favor in this survey, and that's the lowest number that we've seen since we began asking this question. It's actually down 11 points from just last year. And 7 in 10 are opposed to more oil drilling off the coast today. Looking across the state, it's fewer than a third across all regions in favor. Those in inland counties are slightly more likely than those on the coast to be in favor, but even still, it's fewer than a third in favor inland of more oil drilling off the coast. Kind of connecting this to how people feel about global warming. Among those who told us that they think global warming is a very serious threat, 79% are opposed to more drilling. Among the smaller group who said that global warming is not a serious threat to the state, 74% are in favor of more drilling. We can compare these numbers on oil drilling to something else we asked, which was about allowing wind power and wave energy projects off the coast, and that's the gray bars on this chart. There you can see it's about 3 in 4 adults and likely voters in favor of wind and wave power projects, and similar numbers across parties, which is in contrast to what we see with oil drilling, where it's half of Republicans in favor of that, but fewer Democrats and independents. On this wind and wave power question, it's at least 7 in 10, whether inland or coastal residents, and younger adults are more likely than older adults to favor wind and wave energy, but at least 2 in 3 across age groups are in favor. When we ask about oil, there's also this difference between younger and older, but on that, it's 3 in 10 or fewer in favor, regardless of age. So let me just kind of wrap up and bring out some of the key points, and then we can do questions. First, going back to the approval ratings, what we found is that, as I showed, approval for the governor and legislature on handling environmental issues has risen since Jerry Brown took office in 2011. It's about half approving, also about half approving of their job performance overall. Approval at the federal level is much lower, at around a quarter on both overall and environmental issues for the president and for Congress. On the issue of water, many today still see their water supply as a big problem, and a majority say that their local government is doing enough to conserve water. On air pollution, about a quarter across the state say that it's a big problem for them. And a majority say it's a bigger problem in lower income areas. For the ocean and beach questions, nearly everyone says that the condition is very important, both to the state and to themselves personally. And finally, on climate change, we see that most think the effects of global warming are happening now, that they're a serious threat to the state, and majorities, including notable shares of Republicans, favor some state actions to address it. So with that, I can take questions. We have friendly staff walking around with microphones, so please raise your hand, and then somebody can give a mic to you so everybody can hear your question.
So first, thanks for the presentation. It was very informative.
Thank you.
I want to make a distinction between higher gas prices and higher fuel costs. At one point, it seemed like you were equating the two, but you actually could have, if gas prices go up, but you're getting more miles per gallon because of California's vehicle standards, your fuel costs could actually go down. Or if you bought an electric car, your fuel costs could go down. Or even if transit improved enough so that you were able to leave the car at home. So ARB actually projects that household fuel costs will go down, even though clearly gas prices will go up.
That's a good point. And in the questions, we're specifically talking about gas prices, but I think it's worth pointing out that that may not necessarily increase fuel costs. I think we have one up here.
Hello, I'm Surbi. I'm one of the PPIC interns. My question was on the slide that you had on renewable energy and the willingness to pay for renewable energy. When you posed the question to the people you were surveying, how did you indicate what that cost would look like? Or was it just a question on, would you be willing to pay more without putting a number on it?
Exactly, yeah. So that question is simply, would you be willing to pay more or not willing in order to address global warming? And what we like to do when we can is tie it to a specific number, if there is one, But for this, it was actually a question that we had borrowed last year from a national survey, so we could make a comparison with it. But in any case, I think it's, while not specific, it does give you just kind of a general indication of if that's kind of a roadblock for somebody, that they're going to say, no, I would never pay more for it. And of course, some people will say no because they don't know what the cost is. But yeah, that's just general. And again, what we found on that was about half saying they would pay more, and that's similar to what we found when we asked last year. Thanks. Either.
Hey, thank you. My question was on the water conservation. Did you ask any questions that kind of differentiated between local efforts to conserve and statewide efforts, or just local?
That was just local, yeah. Thanks. We had, I think at one point we were considering asking about statewide or both, but felt it might be easier for people to look at their local district.
Thank you. I will share my thanks for you guys continuing to do these surveys. They make a big difference in Sacramento every year. I have a couple of questions. One is, I find the term price ceiling one that's even challenging for policy wonks. Were you actually using that terminology in your question, or?
We said ceiling, but I think we phrase it as set a ceiling on prices.
So that's still kind of wonky, and
Yeah.
I'm wondering how many average Californians would even understand what that means, especially given how difficult it is to understand cap and trade. And while I understand you have less than 25 words to explain all of these things, I'm wondering how valid you think your cap and trade questions actually are in the end, because it is so complicated.
It is, and now you know how hard our job is. But yeah, no, I think that's all fair. And when we were thinking about asking about the price ceiling, right, like, who knows? But that's why we kind of tried to craft the question in a way that it's not just saying do you favor a price ceiling, but kind of what that might mean. So it was, do you favor setting a ceiling of prices that would limit the cost to businesses, even if that meant it might reduce the chances of meeting the goals, or however we phrased it. So then at least you're getting some validity out of it. If people don't know what ceiling is, they can kind of compare those two options. And it's similar, a challenge that we have when we're just talking about the system, because more than half of people have never heard about it, you know, and how do you try to describe it in a way that somebody's not gonna hang up on you while you're asking the question? So it's, each of the questions you have to kind of look at the responses and know that that's how people feel about that question. You know, given slightly different information, they might feel differently about it, but kind of if knowing what you know and knowing what the question is, that's kind of how it is best to interpret it.
Yeah, I guess I would just say that all of us who work in this field should not dance away thinking that the answer is clear on this one. It's such a complicated issue, and it's, as you've suggested, it's really hard to explain. The other thing I'm wondering is on the, and both for the wind energy, solar energy, liking to see that developed on the coast, and on the question of desal, was there a geographic difference? I'm wondering if it made a difference if you were coastal or if you were inland.
I think any differences there were pretty minimal. And on both of those, I think the desalination question we hadn't asked for 11 years. The wind and wave power was a brand new question for us. So it was kind of interesting to see what the responses were, and I think we will be interested in looking back or going back to those and asking some more detail and kind of getting more shades and different angles on it.
Thank
for
you.
sure.
Hi,
Okay.
that actually reminded me of a question too. Was there any mention of water recycling in the poll?
No, there wasn't.
Has there been in previous environmental polls?
We have not asked about water recycling.
Okay. And then what was the determination for likely voters? How many previous elections?
Oh boy. We have, if you are interested in the exact detail, which I can't recite, you know, from memory, it's on the website, but it includes, we ask people how frequently they vote, you know, so it's not looking specifically at elections. I think you have to meet the threshold of, say, you almost always vote, something like that. And then there are things like interest in politics and paying attention to news, that kind of thing. So it's quite a few questions we put together, and it's kind of our model of the best estimate of who's likely to vote. And in a situation like this, where the election is not until next year, it's more of, we look at it more of frequent voters, like who are the people who usually turn out in elections.
Okay. And do you, probably not off the top of your head, but do you have an idea of how many people you polled under 35 who would fall under likely voters?
No, I can't tell you that, but I do know we have on our website another fact sheet that deals with likely voters and has all kinds of breakdowns. So it would include age. And you asked about this survey, but it's pretty standard what we see across surveys in terms of what those groups look like.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm excited to look at the crosstabs, but I'm curious if you saw that any demographic groups outside of party affiliation was able to predict their thoughts on paying more for the environmental work.
No, not off the top of my head. The one thing that I remember being interesting was that across the income groups, it was pretty similar. And as Deborah mentioned, some of the regional groups, there were differences where I think it was Central Valley and Inland Empire less likely than elsewhere to say so. But yeah, please have a look at the crosstabs because there's everything we have available is there.
Hi, I'm Rifat. I'm also a PPIC intern. So I was
Welcome.
working on a project in my master's program that's also on cap and trade program. So I was, I saw a report from PPIC that was telling, I'm not sure that was a survey or not, but that was saying that the revenue by selling the emission allowances has been begun to slow, after May 16 or June 16. So do you think people are losing their support for the cap and trade program? And what might be the I know that's off topic. So do you have any suggestions or any idea of why the revenue has begun to slow?
The revenue?
Revenue, yeah, by selling the.
That wasn't a survey publication, so I can't speak to that. But as far as people's opinions on it, what I see is that most people don't know what it is. So if you're getting into the detail of has revenue changed, I doubt that's changing many people's opinions. On the other hand, some people have heard of it and are tuned in, so I can't say. But the support we saw for it this year, again, is similar to where it's been, but it happens to be the highest number that we've seen at 56%.
Because desal is pretty energy and also carbon intensive, did you look at any relationship between people's perceptions of climate change and their support or opposition to desal?
No, I do not think so. Though I think that based on it was 3 and 4, or I'm sorry, 2 and 3, and that's pretty high. So it's pretty broad across groups, and considering the amount of concern that many Californians have about climate change, I would expect many people who are concerned about it are also in favor of desalination, just to have both of those numbers be so high. But again, as I mentioned, I think that's a question or an issue we would like to ask more about, just to kind of see further detail on what people think or know about it. Any other questions? All right, well, I want to thank you all very much for being here and hope to see you at another survey briefing. Thanks.